Welcome to Stupid Monkey Philosophy Channel, a Trusty Ape co-production. I'm your host, Kevin Chaos. Don't forget to subscribe, share the content with your friends. If you are able, please consider supporting the channel via one-time donation to my PayPal account, monthly subscription to my Patreon, or by purchasing downloadable music content via my Reverb Nation or Bandcamp pages. Links in the description below. For inquiries and collaborations, please contact me at stupidmonkeyphilosophy@gmail.com. That's stupidmonkeyphilosophy, all lowercase, all together, at gmail.com. Thanks for watching. All right. John Locke, born 29th of August 1632, lived until 28th of October 1704, was an English philosopher and physician widely regarded as one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers and commonly known as the father of liberalism. Considered one of the first of the British empiricists, following the tradition of Sir Francis Bacon, Locke is equally important to social contract theory. His work greatly affected the development of epistemology and political philosophy. His writings influenced Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and many Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, as well as the American revolutionaries. His contributions to classical republicanism and liberal theory are reflected in the United States Declaration of Independence. Internationally, Locke's political legal principles continue to have a profound influence on the theory and practice of limited representative government and the protection of basic rights and freedoms under the rule of law. Locke's theory of mind is often cited as the origin of modern conceptions of identity and the self, figuring prominently in the work of later philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant. Locke was the first to define the self through the continuity of consciousness. He postulated that, at birth, the mind was a blank slate, or tabula rasa. Contrary to Cartesian philosophy based on pre-existing concepts, he maintained that we are born without innate ideas and that knowledge is instead determined only by experience derived from sense perception, a concept now known as empiricism. Demonstrating the ideology of science in his observations, whereby something must be capable of being tested repeatedly, and that nothing is exempt from being disproved. Locke stated that whatever I write, as soon as I discover it not to be true, my hand shall be the forwardest to throw it into the fire. Such is one example of Locke's belief in empiricism. Non-maleficence. Do no harm is to avoid exposing people to additional risks through our actions. Do no harm means taking a step back from an intervention to look at the broader context and mitigate potential negative effects on the social fabric, the economy, and the environment, incorporating the principle of do no harm. Primum non nocere. The phrase is sometimes recorded as primum nil nocere, or non-maleficence, which is derived from the maxim as one of the principal precepts of bioethics that all students in healthcare are taught in school and is a fundamental principle throughout the world. Another way to state it is that, given an existing problem, it may be better not to do something, or even to do nothing, than to risk causing more harm than good. It reminds healthcare personnel to consider the possible harm that any intervention might do. It is invoked when debating the use of an intervention that carries an obvious risk of harm, but a less certain chance of benefit. Non-maleficence is often contrasted with its corollary, beneficence. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges every one, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. We'll briefly pull a few excerpts from Locke's first treatise of government, which is a refutation of Sir Robert Filmer. So we won't spend too much time here, but just to get a general idea of Locke's concerns with Filmer's arguments, which were prominent at the time. And then we'll jump into the second treatise. Quote, "In this last age, a generation of men has sprung up amongst us that would flatter princes with an opinion that they have a divine right to absolute power. Let the laws by which they are constituted and are to govern, and the conditions under which they enter upon their authority, be what they will, and their engagements to observe them ever so well ratified by solemn oaths and promises. To make way for this doctrine, they have denied mankind a right to natural freedom, whereby they have not only as much as in them lies exposed all subjects to the utmost misery of tyranny and oppression, but have also unsettled the titles and shaken the thrones of princes, for they too, by these men's system, except only one, all are born slaves, and by divine right are subjects to Adam's right heir. As if they had designed to make war upon all government and subvert the very foundations of human society to serve their present turn. For from him every one who would be as fashionable as French was at court has learned and runs away with this short system of politics, viz. Men are not born free, and therefore could never have the liberty to choose either governors or forms of government." End quote. "Princes have their power absolute and by divine right, for slaves could never have a right to compact or consent." Here we're dealing with the consent of common men and Locke's opposition to what might be called the divine right of kings. Continue. "Consider whether they do not give the world cause to suspect that it is not the force of reason and argument that makes them for absolute monarchy, but some other by interest, and therefore are resolved to applaud any author that writes in favor of this doctrine, whether he support it with reason or no. But I hope they do not expect that rational and indifferent men should be brought over to their opinion." And here we've omitted several arguments from creation myth. "But I ask then, upon Adam's death, what becomes of both his natural and private domination? And I doubt not it will be answered that they descended to his next heir, as our author tells us in several places, but this way it is plain cannot possibly convey both his natural and private dominion to the same person. For should we allow that all the property, all the estate of the father ought to descend to the eldest son, which will need some proof to establish it, and so he has by that title all the private dominion of the father, yet the father's natural dominion, the paternal power, cannot descend to him by inheritance, for it being a right that accrues to a man only by begetting. No man can have this natural dominion over any one he does not beget. Or it be sense to say that a man by birth is under the natural dominion of his father, only because he begat him. And a man by birth also is under the natural dominion of his eldest brother, though he did not beget him." And there's a good deal of mockery throughout this refutation. An interesting read. And now we move to the second treatise, which is much more important. It's concerning the true original extent and end of civil government. And chapter 1 of political power. I've omitted several lines here, so just return from the second portion, move forward. To this purpose, I think it may not be amiss to set down what I take to be political power. The power of a magistrate over subject may be distinguished from that of a father over his children, a master over his servant, a husband over his wife, and a lord over his slave, all which distinct powers happening sometimes together in the same man. If he be considered under these different relations, it may help us to distinguish these powers from one from another, and show the difference betwixt a ruler of the commonwealth, a father of a family, and a captain of a galley. Political power, then, I take to be a right of making laws, with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws, and in the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. Chapter 2. Of the state of nature. And as we read into this, I will have some arguments of my own, just on the very surface level of Locke's writing here, and I will inform you when those come about. To understand political power aright, and derive it from its original, we must consider what a state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions, and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. A state also of equality, wherein all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than the creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another, without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him by an evident and clear appointment an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty. And my notes come as follows. A description of the state of men in nature. I find issue with much of this. The perfect freedom to order their actions. Of course, it's implied that is unless that person be afflicted by another, and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. But again, that is only presuming that another does not impose upon that perfect freedom. And one could also impose upon one's own freedom, certainly, within the bounds of the law of nature. So, as we'll get to moving forward, where are these laws of nature derived from? Where does natural law come from? Surprise, surprise, spoiler alert, Locke is going to derive his natural law from the same place as many other philosophers of that time, and that is going to be a divinity, a god. Without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. But again, that's presuming that they're not being afflicted by the will of another man. And also of equality, and they say, equality amongst whom? Amongst what particular people? Every person? Right. Wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal. Well, that is clearly idealism. This isn't the way things work in nature, and it's not the way things work in ordered society. And no one having more than another. This seems essentially redundant at this point. There's perfect freedom and equality in a reciprocal system does not sound like the state of men in nature. The state of men in nature seems to have driven us to create an ordered society in which this idealism is hopefully more or less upheld, and still, even then, you have to have a hierarchy of leadership in order to even have a foundation for such social order. He says, there being nothing more evident than that the creatures of the same species and rank. Same species and rank. I don't know what rank would be in this context, but even then you'd say, well, what? Nothing more evidenced by what? What brings you to this conclusion? Merely the fact that men create a social order? Promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature. What advantages of nature? Of the nature of themselves? Use of the same faculties? That's a stretch. Not all people are born with the same faculties, and not all are naturally given the same advantages. So one might have superior physical strength, one might have superior mental abilities, having nothing at all to do with the nature, but having to do with environment. You might say, well, the environment is a part of the nature, but the environment can be changed and manipulated. The nature of the thing, as Locke is putting it, would be something inherent, by my understanding, and should also be equal one amongst another. This is mere circularity, without subordination or subjection. And once again, we go back to the fact that a hierarchy will exist amongst all species, unless the Lord and Master of them all, who's Lord and Master of them all, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above the other, and that implying that there is some lawgiver of nature, and that this person, this ultimate lawgiver, may set one above the other, thus creating an inequality, and confer on him by an evident and clear appointment. Some people may interpret the Bible that way. But how evidenced and clear to whom, right? Because different people may have different interpretations of the Bible or other holy books. An undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty over who? Others. That's creating an unequal system. So even though the argument states that all men would be equal and none subordinate to the other, and it says, well, but if some master of all of them, some one master of all of them should set one above the other, then sure, yeah, he's definitely superior, and all others would be subordinate. All right, that's a lot. We return to the work. 5. This equality of men by nature, the judicious hooker looks upon as so evident in itself. His words are, the like natural inducement hath brought men to know that it is no less their duty to love others than themselves, for seeing those things which are equal must needs all have one measure. If I cannot but wish to receive good, even as much at every man's hands, as any man can wish unto his own soul, how should I look to have any part of my desire herein satisfied, unless myself be careful to satisfy the like desire, which is undoubtedly in other men weak? Being of one and the same nature, to have anything offered them repugnant to this desire must needs, in all respects, grieve them as much as me, so that if I do harm, I must look to suffer, there being no reason that others should show greater measure of love to me than they have been showed by me, than they have, by me showed unto them. My desire, therefore, to be loved of my equals in nature, as much as possibly may be, imposeth upon me a natural duty of bearing to themward fully the like affection. From which relation of equality between ourselves and them that are as ourselves, what several rules and canons natural reason hath drawn for direction of life, no man is ignorant. So this is essentially a long-winded do unto others as you would have them do unto you argument. Six. But though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license, though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges every one, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, for men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker. To reiterate, Locke says, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, for men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker. So, by Locke's view here, we do not have the right to harm ourselves or one another, because God made all of us, and he is omnipotent and infinitely wise. And so we are all, continuing the work here, all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business. Right. They are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his, not one another's, pleasure. So, for atheists such as myself, this is a non sequitur. We cannot prove the omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker. I do not believe that entity, that deity, is master to me, and that I am sent into the world by his order and about his business, making me his property. Right? So God's the ultimate slave master here. Continue. And being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination amongst us that may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. And so that be another biblical argument, that men are somehow superior to, humans are somehow superior to all of the creatures on the planet, and therefore they are made subordinate, inferior to us for our use. Every one as he is bound to preserve himself, and not to quit his station wilfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and not unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. And to notice we've put so life, health, and limb lumped in with liberty and goods, right? This is not merely the preservation of your health and well-being and the continued existence of oneself, right? But a free existence in which your goods are secured, your property is secure. This is very important in Locke's theory, which is contrary to a lot of Eastern philosophy, which states that as long as you can preserve your life, property is kind of merely this hindrance, really, to the absolute mental freedom. In something like Buddhism, you'd want to live with the absolute minimum, but in Locke's theory, you have the right to your property as much as you have the right to your freedom and your health. And in my notes, I ask, do we not have the liberty to destroy ourselves? This is stated very plainly up there that essentially you don't have the right to die. I think we've thoroughly disproven that. There's still some who contest it. But again, why would you not have the right to end your own life, to forego the preservation? Certainly many people have. And the only real explanation for this is that you're God's property. And I don't know. Or so much as any creature in his possession. To destroy any creature in his possession, he does not have the liberty. But clearly, it's already been said that all the other creatures in Locke's theory here are inferior, and therefore we actually do have the liberty to destroy that creature, apparently, as long as it's for some purpose that we find desirable. But where some nobler use, then its bare preservation calls for it. So, some nobler use. How would you determine a nobility, right? And this is clearly based on the judgments of men, unless you're speaking directly to your master creator God here, in which case you may want to go get your head checked. And finally, if the law of nature is reason, then what of all these unreasonable men, right? So all men abide this law of nature, and yet clearly they do not, because you wouldn't have to establish a judicial system. You wouldn't have to establish what we're going to get into, this system of punishments for offenses. If all men were in fact reasonable, we would just all naturally obey this law, but that's not the case. And I just have to go back and just reiterate again, quote, "No one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, for men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker." But you cannot prove this maker. What if he does not exist? And you're right back where you started from. There's no grounding for this claim without God. And it's essentially the entirety of this argument. All the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his and not one another's pleasure. And so without God, the claim is there would be no reason, and this is a mere argument from authority. All right, now we'll talk about crime and punishment. Returning to the work, 7. And that all men may be restrained from invading others' rights, and from doing hurt to one another, the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. The execution of the law of nature is in that state to put into every man's hands, whereby every one has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. For the law of nature would, as all other laws that concern men in this world, be in vain if there were nobody that in the state of nature had a power to execute that law, and thereby preserve the innocent and restrain offenders. And if any one in the state of nature may punish another for any evil he has done, every one may do so. For For in that state of perfect equality, where naturally there is no superiority or jurisdiction of one over another, what any may do in prosecution of that law, every one must needs have a right to do. Back to my notes. It appears Locke is advocating for vigilantism here. So everyone has the right to punish transgressors. Well, that claim has not withstood the test of time, and there's a reason now that we have appointed officials who go out and enforce the law and bring offenders into a separate court or some type of legal middle, depending upon what your system is, right? But now in certain places, sure, everyone has the right to self-defense to some extent, but we've also put limits on how you are allowed to defend your health and your property and things like that. It has to be proportional to the actual threat that you're going to be harmed, and obviously, in most of Western civilization, at least, taking the life of another for, mere property theft is considered disproportionate, right? But everyone has the right to punish a transgressor. This seems like mob rule. So if one person is merely accused of a crime, everyone has the right to punish this person, and that's worked out terribly for us at many points in history. So, and then finally, it says that law would be in vain if not enforced. Preserve the innocent and restrain the offender, and anyone may punish another. But this is in a state of perfect equality, and there's no superiority or jurisdiction of one man over another. And yet you must actually claim superiority and jurisdiction over a person if you punish them for an alleged transgression. You're now inhibiting, in some sense, their liberty or their health or their well-being or their property, right? So you've actually just assumed a jurisdiction to do so. Presumably, it should be proportional to whatever wrong they have done. But this leaves no room for I can't think of a word for it right now. It's not in my notes, but what any may do in prosecution of that law, everyone must needs have a right to do. This is somewhat ambiguous, I think. It's saying that just because one person might do this, that everyone ought to do this. But some people are going to be a lot more offended by theft of their property, or as it states above, in many places and points in history, the child is considered the property of the parent, usually the father. And in that case, if you were to compare the theft of your child or the taking of your child to your cattle or an axe, some inanimate thing, you would have a very disproportional kind of system. So obviously these things have to be categorized in order of what's more important in defending the preservation of one's life and one's livelihood, and what's merely an inconvenience, and how harmful or not that action really is. We return. 8. And thus, in the state of nature, one man comes by a power over another, but yet no absolute or arbitrary power to use a criminal when he has got him in his hands, according to the passionate heats or boundless extravagancy of his own will, but only to retribute to him so far as calm reason and conscience dictate what is proportionate to his transgression, which is so much as may serve for reparation and restraint. And so the breakdown of this is kind of what we were just mentioning. One man comes by power over another, right? So that is subordination. And according to this is through this natural law. It is yet not absolute or arbitrary. So this seems contradictory to what we were just reading, because it says that any man may punish them as they see fit, and yet it must not be extravagant. But we know that people who are, feel that they have been done wrong will frequently blow that out of proportion. They will exaggerate the harm that's been inflicted upon them because it's them feeling it, And, we get such craziness as, that somebody might, literally cut off the hand of a thief, which most people now would consider barbaric, right? So essentially they're saying you cannot commit a crime against a criminal. That's not proportionate. And yet you would take possession of this person and collect your retribution, and expecting a calm reason and clear conscience in this person who is now reprimanding this offender. And if you are the one who is the victim of this offense, it's very unlikely that you will have calm reason and conscience to merely make reparation for whatever crime was committed and restrain that person from offending again. In other words, they must pay some sort of due for the offense they've already caused, and it should be not so severe as to be, considered cruel, but severe enough that they would fear having to go through that again, so they would be dissuaded from committing that offense. All right, we return. For these are the only two. For these two are the only reasons why one man may lawfully do harm to another, which is that we call punishment. In transgressing the law of nature, the offender declares himself to live by another rule than that of reason and common equity. And yet, my question is, what other rule? Because you do that of reason and common equity, but we have unreasonable men. We have men who believe that they have some authority or superiority over another. And when I say men, I mean people and humans. I'm just using the language and the format which we're reading from. And Locke goes on to say, which is that measure God has set to the actions of men for their mutual security. And we get into the question of who's God. There are many gods with many different sets of rules throughout history. So I think we can safely presume that Locke is speaking as some denomination of Christian or Catholic. And so, sure, if you're living by that standard, there's still some matters of dispute over the finer points of what is meant in the Christian Bible. But for the most part, they can generally have worked out the the more divisive of those, and now it's merely down to specific interpretations. Of course, there are more extreme sects, but if you have the whole Christian world pitted against all other religions, you begin to have a problem. That's why we can't have this global sense of unity, and we still have holy wars being fought around the world, because some of these ideas are so outrageous to people of other faiths that there's really a disconnect there. All right, return. And so he becomes dangerous to mankind, the tie which is to secure them from injury and violence. What security do men have from injury and violence in nature, I ask? being slighted and broken by him, which being a trespass against the whole species. Okay, so this part of the argument it's a little bit harder to parse out, and I've broken up several other questions in here for you. So we go back and say that, all right, in transgressing the law of nature, the offender declares himself to live by another rule. Reason and common equity is the measure that God has set to the actions of men for mutual security. And so he becomes dangerous to mankind. So one offender lives by a different rule than that measure that God has set, according to Locke, for mutual security. Being slighted and broken by him, being a trespass against the whole species. So one man pitted against another under a different rule than that of reason and common equity is a trespass against all. This is problematic because then you're not actually using reason in this argument. You're merely saying that in some moral conflict that this one person who does not abide by the rules of this one God, who he may have no information about, right, is now an offense against all other people. This is presuming a whole lot about the motivations of other people you might not understand. Continue. And the peace and safety of it, provided for by the law of nature, every man upon this score, by the right he hath to preserve mankind in general, may restrain, or where it is necessary, destroy things noxious to them, and so may bring such evil on anyone who hath transgressed that law, as may make him repent the doing of it, and thereby deter him, and by his example others from doing the like mischief. And in this case, and upon this ground, every man hath a right to punish the offender, and be executioner of the law of nature. And, well, now we go into my notes, which will reiterate everything I've been saying here. This declaration of reason and common equity is like common sense. Common sense is not so common. And if you're talking about a state of nature, well, a state of nature is one thing, but in advanced modern societies, we have a much different sense of what common equity is. And, you could say this is actually something that would, if we were to follow this, you would end up with some advanced type of socialism, right? The rich could never be super rich. Because by definition, you would be taking more than your share of resources. It has nothing to do with your personal merits. It's an accumulated wealth creates an inequitable state in which one person can manipulate whole groups of people using sheer monetary resources. It has nothing to do with the actual fitness of the person. Set by God for mutual security, presumably of all persons, and yet, this person would be transgressing not merely the others around them, right? They would be transgressing against this God. What are the laws of this God, and where do they come from, right? Well, you say nature, but I don't think the Bible was found in nature. Even according to the book itself, there were all these people kind of roaming about in this natural state without a set of laws until God delivers the laws in the Bible, I guess. Are injury and violence not natural? certainly injury and violence happen in all states of nature amongst all species, and humans are no exception to that. So this presumption that in this ideal world, this perfectly natural state, these things would not occur. They would have to, unless all species were vegan and nobody ever had misunderstanding, and desperation was not an emotion that we harbored as living sentient beings, right? But all these things are in fact true. A single trespass, one against the whole species, I'm not sure that can quite be said to be true. And many racists would have argued that no, I mean, trespassing against people of what they would have called inferior races at times, we're not in fact a trespass against anybody, because if you believe that you are superior amongst men, we'll say like white men, then you can see no problem with trespassing against a whole other group of people, as long as they don't look exactly like you. Are peace and safety provided by nature? See, that's a clear no. In nature, the elements are harsh. One must actually fight for an environment. That you have to put in a tremendous amount of effort to clothe and shelter yourself and make sure you're eating well out in the natural elements. Peace and safety are by no means guaranteed. And never mind the fact that some of these inferior creatures we call inferior creatures, might maul us and have us for dinner. Those seem to be the conditions provided by nature. So peace and safety are really something that people have to put in a great deal of effort to achieve, and not so much anymore, because we've done so much work to these ends that we've tamed many of these natural elements and other creatures that could do us harm, and yet they still exist. And we know that for us to go so far as to discontinue their existence is actually not good for us. It does much more long-term harm than the short-term benefit of that temporary safety. Do we have the right to preserve mankind in general? Where do we derive this right from? Merely from our state of being? Merely because it is our biological function? Or one would have to believe in God, I suppose. Restrain or destroy that which is noxious to them. Maybe in some cases, but I don't know that again, that's not a right. When you're talking about rights in nature, well, I don't see that many rights exist in nature, right? And so to restrain or destroy that which is noxious to you is merely a means of survival, is not a something that is governed by law. And so many people will die. Everybody will die, but many people will die in a very in a way that is not preferable, I suppose you'd say. It is not comfortable. We've gone through these others. To bring evil upon transgressors. Yeah, and I think the language goes overboard, because Locke went from, it has to be kind of this temperate and restrained form of punishment, but you bring that evil upon that transgressor to make them repent and deter their future offenses. Yeah, there seems to be some element of this kind of, as you'd say, Western superiority in this philosophy. They believe they have this supreme holy book, and that's really going to ground where Locke's going to get his morality from. But if somebody does not share that same Christian morality, Locke does not seem to account for this. Although he will in the following lines. So we return. 9. I doubt not but this will seem a very strange doctrine to some men, but before they condemn it, I desire them to resolve me by what right any prince or state can put to death or punish an alien for any crime he commits in their country. It is certain their laws, by virtue of any sanction they receive from the promulgated will of the legislator, reach not a stranger. They speak not to him, nor if they did is he bound to hearken to them. The legislative authority by which they are in force over the subjects of that commonwealth hath no power over him. Those who have the supreme power of making laws in England, France, or Holland are, to an Indian, but like the rest of the world, men without authority. And therefore, if by the law of nature every man hath not a power to punish offences against it, as he soberly judges the case to require, I see not how the magistrates of any community can punish an alien of another country, since in reference to him they can have no more power than what every man naturally may have over another. So revisit that last line. I see not how the magistrates of any community can punish an alien of another country, since in reference to him they can have no more power than what every man naturally may have over another. And so this ties a bit into what I was speaking about, because if as they say, if these men in these Christian nations, England, France, or Holland, at least at that time, are to an Indian, but like the rest of the world, without authority, right? Because India clearly would not have been that Christian nation, right? And so, in other words, an Englishman can't punish an Indian in their country because they do not abide by the same law, because the law is given by the men in that country, not by this supreme creator, not by this creator God. So if natural law is, would have to be universal to all members of the species, right? It wouldn't be different country by country. 10. Besides the crime which consists in violating the laws and varying from the right rule of reason, whereby a man so far becomes degenerate and declares himself to quit the principles of human nature and to be a noxious creature, there is commonly injury done, and some person or other, some other man, receives damage by his transgression, in which case he who has received any damage has, besides the right of punishment common to him with other men, a particular right to seek reparation from him that hath done it, and any other person who finds it just may also join with him that is injured, and assist him in recovering from the offender so much as may make satisfaction for the harm he hath suffered. So, in this view, you have not only the right to seek some punishment upon the person, whether it be they're jailed or imprisoned or enslaved for a time, but also whatever you feel entitled to in punitive damage, right? So yeah, I'm going to add some debt to your punishment. And others should join in and help me collect. So take from that what you will. 11. Too far. From these two distinct rights, the one of punishing the crime for restraint and preventing the like offense, which right of punishing is in everybody, The other, of taking reparation, belongs only to the injured party. So everybody can gather around and string him up, however they want to do that punishment, but not everyone can just take the reparations. Those reparations have to go directly to the injured party. Comes it to pass that the magistrate, who by being magistrate hath the common right of punishing put into his hands, can often, where the public good demands, not the execution of the law, remit the punishment of criminal offences by his own authority, but yet cannot remit the satisfaction due to any private man for the damage he has received, that he who hath suffered the damage has a right to demand in his own name, and he alone can remit. The damnified person has this power of appropriating to himself the goods or service of the offender by right of self-preservation, as every man has a power to punish the crime to prevent its being committed again, by the right he has of preserving all mankind and doing all reasonable things he can in order to that end. So anyone can punish this criminal, but only the person who he has committed a crime against can decide what goods or service that he wants in exchange for the offense, right? This is by the right of self-preservation. And I don't see how you can claim that. Obviously, the self-preservation merely means that you're not going to be deprived of your life or your health, right? But again, if somebody took your cow and you've got 18 other cows and they were going to starve to death, you're still not. But now it's according to this self-preservation that you can make him work in order to satisfy that debt. And yet your self was never actually in jeopardy, unless you believe that yourself is entitled to 20 cows or whatever it be. All right. Continue. And thus it is that every man in the state of nature has a power to kill a murderer, both to deter others from doing the like injury, which no reparation can compensate, by the example of the punishment that attends it from everybody, and also to secure men from the attempts of a criminal, who, having renounced reason, the common rule and measure God hath given to mankind, hath, by the unjust violence and slaughter he hath committed upon one, declared war against all mankind, and therefore may be destroyed as a lion or tiger, one of those wild savage beasts with whom men can have no society nor security. And upon this is grounded that the great law of nature, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And Cain was so fully convinced that every one had a right to destroy such a criminal, that after the murder of his brother he cries out, Every one that findeth me shall slay me. So plain was it writ in the hearts of all mankind. And here we go back to, now, Locke's making a biblical argument. So, I don't know about the right to kill a murderer or the power to kill a murderer. Usually, murderers are either one of two things. They're going to be extremely strong and or cunning, right? So you're not going to know they are a murderer. They do these things in secret for the most part. And even now we have determined that it's less often is it appropriate to take a life for the taking of a life. Some people may disagree with that, but and to the ends that we don't always know why people commit murders. Sometimes these things seem to be somewhat justified. People who are physically and psychologically abusive for years. People who abuse their children, the children kill them, and it seems inappropriate to take the life of that child when they were in fact the victim of abuse. So these are all very kind of, I don't know, fable like black and white examples, and using this potentially fictional story from the Bible, parable, I guess you would say, doesn't seem to lend itself to his argument. All right. 12. By the same reason may a man in the state of nature punish the lesser breaches of that law, it will perhaps be demanded with death. I answer, each transgression may be punished to that degree and with so much severity as will suffice to make it an ill bargain to the offender, give him cause to repent, and terrify others from doing the like. Every offense that can be committed in the state of nature may, in the state of nature, be also punished equally, and as far forth as it may in a commonwealth. So, it's very clearly stated here. If you want to make the offender, feel bad, you want to make him feel bad, and you want to make him sorry, and you want to make sure that you make an example of him. That's key here. We will do it back to you, and it will scare anyone else who has this similar idea. So yeah, if we say, well, is death, usually proportionate? No, death is only proportionate to death, right? But again, if you think that we should take the hands off of those who might steal, and not take into account that person's station, their situation, the fact that they may have no food and this other person may have a lot of food, and the fact that they need to steal is for their self-preservation, right? And in a state of nature, in a perfect state of nature, according to Locke, there would be no reason for one to go without while another is in abundance, because it would be a perfect state of equity, right? And there would be no unreasonable men who would let another man starve, because we all have the right to the preservation of mankind. But this doesn't seem to be the way the state of nature actually behaves, or the way men actually behave in nature, I suppose would be better phrasing of that. Okay, we return. For though it would be beside my present purpose to enter here into the particulars of the law of nature or its measures of punishment, yet it is certain there is such a law, and that too as intelligible and plain to a rational creature and a studier of that law as the positive laws of commonwealths, nay, possibly plainer, as much as reason is easier to be understood than the fancies and intricate contrivances of men, following contrary and hidden interests put into words. For truly so are a great part of the municipal laws of countries, which are only so far right as they are founded on the law of nature, by which they are to be regulated and interpreted. So back to this circular reasoning of what the law of nature entails. But we can't get into the particulars, right? What are the particular laws of nature? Well, yeah, equity and such. But those should be reflected in the laws that are upheld by the commonwealths. So say you, John Locke, but in what what law of nature is against acts of homosexuality or something like this, right? Which have been preserved in many of these societies, and there are many others. So one is the presumption that one knows what is good for everyone, and therefore can prescribe what others ought do and not do. And if there is some discrepancy, they will simply imprison or punish those who they deem to be offenders, even if they cannot prove a reason that this is doing some harm to another person. A great example is like drug abusers. drug addicts are still routinely treated criminally in many countries, some more severe than others, but the fact of the matter is that most drug abusers are merely causing harm to themselves. And at what point is this a system of control and not equity? It's behavioral control that has nothing to do with the state of nature. It has to do with the state of an orderly society founded upon certain moral principles. All right, 13. To this strange doctrine is that in the state of nature everyone has the executive power of the law of nature. I doubt not, but it will be objected that it is unreasonable for men to be judges in their own cases, that self-love will make men partial to themselves and their friends, and on the other side, ill nature, passion, and revenge will carry them too far in punishing others, and hence nothing but confusion and disorder will follow, and that therefore God hath certainly appointed government to restrain the partiality and violence of men. I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great where men may be judges in their own case, since it is easy to be imagined that he who was so unjust as to do his brother an injury will scarce be so just as to condemn himself for it. But I shall desire those who make this objection to remember that absolute monarchs are but men, and if government is to be the remedy of those evils which necessarily follow from men being judges in their own cases, and the state of nature is therefore not to be endured, I desire to know what kind of government that is, and how much better it is than the state of nature, where one man commanding a multitude has the liberty to be judge in his own case, and may do all his subjects whatever he pleases, may do to all his subjects whatever he pleases, without the least question or control of those who execute his pleasure. And in whatsoever he doth, whether led by reason, mistake, or passion, must be submitted to, which men in the state of nature are not bound to do to one another. And if he that judges amiss in his own or any other case, he is answerable for it to the rest of mankind. So this is interesting because once again, Locke seems to fall into contradiction that every man should be able to punish an offender accordingly to this law of nature, and yet you cannot judge in your own case. That you're going to be partial to yourself and your friend. You'll have ill natures, passions, and revenge, which will carry you too far. So any man cannot actually punish this offender, right? Because the man who is the victim can collect the debt. But Locke says there has to be this impartial judge, and thankfully God hath certainly appointed government, right? No, this is weak argumentation. If anything, and even here by his own standard, that if a God appoints the government, but this one man commanding the multitude has the liberty to be judge in his own case and do to all his subjects whatever he pleases, well then that seems like it would be a question of who's God and whose appointment, right? If God appointed a government and it was the correct government, it would be just the one world government, right? It wouldn't be England and France and Holland and India, as you said earlier. We would all have one God and one government and one nature. And would be answerable for it to the rest of mankind. Well, no, that person would only be answerable to those of his subjects who took him to task and held him accountable. It may be the case that the rest of mankind is completely ignorant of this situation, as has happened in history. 14. It is often asked as a mighty objection, where are or ever were there any men in such a state of nature? That is a good question. To which it may suffice as an answer at present that since all princes and rulers of, quote, independent governments all through the world are in a state of nature, it is plain the world never was, nor never will be, without numbers of men in that state. I have named all governors of independent communities, whether they are or are not in league with others, for it is not every compact that puts an end to the state of nature between men, but only this one of agreeing together mutually to enter into one community and make one body politic. Other promises and compacts men may make with one another, and yet still be in the state of nature. The promises and bargains for truck, etc., between two men in Soldania, in or between a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America, are binding to them, though they are perfectly in a state of nature in reference to one another for truth, and keeping of faith belongs to men as men, but not as members of society. I guess he was talking about Native Americans rather than India. So let's look at that again. The keeping of faith belongs to men as men and not as members of society. So essentially, he's saying these kind of lesser compacts and an agreement made between two neighbors, say, are merely those in the state of nature. It's only once the whole neighborhood decides to form a homeowners association that they mutually entered into a community and made a body politic, right? And this is how, and sure, that's to some extent the case, I believe, but again, you still have hierarchies in nature. We see those in all throughout the plant and animal kingdom. And so this aggregation into communities is just kind of a byproduct of us propagating more and more humans who are living in a smaller and smaller, more condensed areas. And again, I don't perfectly in a state of nature in reference to one another for truth, and keeping of faith belongs to men as men. I said bullshit answer. I really do think this is an oversimplification of this process, but I understand that's what he's saying. This is how nations are built, rather than mere compacts between two individuals. But that doesn't tell us anything about the hierarchical structures in these, whatever you'd say, wild dominions. Why the apes have hierarchies like ours, and things like that. 15. To those that say there were never any men in the state of nature, I will not oppose the authority of the judicious Hooker, where he says, quote, the laws which have been hitherto mentioned, i.e. the laws of nature, do bind men absolutely, even as they are men, although they have never any settled fellowship, never any solemn agreement amongst themselves what to do or not to do. But forasmuch as we are not by ourselves sufficient to furnish ourselves with competent store of things needful for such a life as our nature doth desire, a life fit for the dignity of man, therefore to supply those defects and imperfections which are in us, as living single and solely by ourselves, we are naturally induced to seek communion and fellowship with others. This was the cause of men uniting themselves as first in politic societies. End quote. But I moreover affirm that all men are naturally in that state, and remain so till, by their own consents, they make themselves members of some politic society, and I doubt not, in the sequel of this discourse, to make it very clear. And that's where we will end this segment and return to finish John Locke's second treatise of government on the next episode. So, this went a bit longer than I had planned. All discombobulated. We'll see you next time.